It's already April here in Mumbai, but the March weather and so far into April, second day of April, has been much cooler than normal and much drier than normal. But also that means there is a strong breeze, which is nice, but it's going to make some noise in my recording, so I'll see how bad it is. This is just a short podcast on some points about the prospects for enhancing climate services in agriculture. We'll look at the definition of climate services in a way in a schematic in the next slide, but I think you have some idea. Weather services have been around for a long time, doing not only meteorological forecasts, applying them for, like ski industries, travel industries, airlines, weather derivatives, banks, and so on. But now climate services is something like El Nino forecast and how they are applied to health and water and agriculture and so on. So this is something that came out of a vast international collaboration. The meeting, I think, was focused much more on Asia Pacific, but the lessons are applicable for everywhere, especially for the global south. Just reading the abstract, agricultural stakeholders can effectively manage the risks and opportunities arising from climate change and variability by enhancing climate services in agriculture. Many of these points will sound rather obvious, and yet when you try to implement or apply weather and climate predictions, especially the so-called sub-seasonal to seasonal timescales, you begin to realize how important it is to keep all these points in mind in terms of who the users are, what their abilities are, what capacity building means, and so on. Key to understanding and addressing the climate challenge is the provision and the use of climate information to aid decision makers and policymakers. Climate services are now integral to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment reports, governments' national adaptation plans, funding bodies, and a growing number of sectors and industries worldwide. Article provides our personal perspective, experience, and views on the important and timely issue of managing better the risks and opportunities to the agricultural sector and community that are arising from changes in climate. We describe a framework to help drive action to tackle the climate change comprising enhanced knowledge climate challenge, comprising enhanced knowledge and information products, efficient information delivery and use, and assured policy and institutional support in an iterative loop. So to achieve the actual goals, you need to have some iteration, feedbacks, and responses from the users and the developers. And delivery is easier than thought, maybe, but use is not, because we have now the words like usable and useful products. So just putting stuff on the web, hoping people will use it, doesn't work as well. So they have to be usable, and most of the advisories being issued, like by the India Meteorological Department, are not used because the products are not considered usable by the farmers. Okay. So climate services, the chain of climate services. This is a paper from Guy Brazier and some collaborator that came in a few years ago. Services, products, and customers. So services include international or national climate data providers, typically like the India Meteorology Department or the NOAA in the US, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. National climate services. So you have a research wing that runs the models, produces the forecasts, and then climate services translates those forecast products to users. And then there are regional climate services, because in a big country like the US or even for India, the climate regimes are different, the needs are different, the sectors requiring the information are different, and so on. The products include observational data, global model projections, global sectorial information, feeding and interacting with. You can imagine these are all interacting with each other, tailored information of national relevance, regional projections, mitigation, and adaptation. So we are combining timescales here. When you go from sub-seasonal to seasonal intra-annual timescales, like the intra-seasonal oscillations or active break periods in the monsoon or El Nino and so on, you have shorter timescales. But when you start using this information for mitigation and adaptation, to some extent you will be depending on projections and not just forecasts. Advisors on good practice, customized mitigation and adaptation measures, development of solutions, education of users, which often is referred to as capacity building as well. The customers will include national climate services, international organizations, and multinational corporations. So we are now talking also about banking sector and financial sectors that are looking for climate risks to consider for their investments and underwriting activities in insurance companies and so on, which feedback with at national level to regional climate services, national governments, professional organizations, consulting firms, and NGOs as well. And at the regional climate service, they would interact with local end users, small enterprises, state governments, and even municipalities, and maybe even lower levels in India, like the panchayats and village level and so on. In terms of the framework, it will have stages for effective development and provisions of climate services for the agricultural sector, especially adapted. This is adapted from an FAO report, but starts with data collection and monitoring. So you have remote sensed, in situ, and field technicians collecting data, so instruments or people, produces information products, and then there is a co-production of climate services with the users, with the kind of feedbacks we are talking about here. And that then goes into enhancing the services. So the communication is important here. Credibility, salience, and legitimacy of the information provider matters a lot. So if I'm forecasting, but if I have to reach the farmers, there will be extension workers who communicate directly with the farmers, have a better rapport and better credibility with them. There is multidisciplinary working groups which have these feedbacks coming in. Now then communication is fled into climate informed decisions, let's say by farmers or farming industries and so on, processing, etc. Feedback mechanism to participatory engagement, and then feeding into multidisciplinary working groups which give you the product to enhance the services. Obviously, every time you try to do this, there are barriers and challenges that can potentially be addressed through the implementation of key components of the climate services framework for agriculture. So we'll look at barriers and challenges, stages of the climate services in agriculture, and key components required to address the barriers and challenges. Let's just read as many of them as possible. It's a long table. Insufficient weather and or climate information, such as long-term high-quality data, climate forecasts with reasonable credibility. So this is particularly so for a country like India, where enormous progress has been made in the last decade, but still it's not at a scale that farmers require, or that repeated use and credibility has not been established yet. The stage is at data collection and monitoring, and key components required are information products. Lack of quality agriculture data regularly collected from agricultural fields and capacity for database management. This is a huge impediment in terms of many details like soil properties, crops, yields, the irrigation methods used by the farmers, and other various policy tools that play into it. Data collection and monitoring, again, information products and information delivery and use are needed. Insufficient weather and agrometeorological stations essential for monitoring weather and agronomic variables, and weak financial support and technical capacities for the long-term maintenance. Data is a huge barrier again. Data collection and monitoring is the stage at which the services are, and information products and institutional and policy support are needed. Inadequate investment in research and development, agro-innovation, and agricultural entrepreneurship, which are essential drivers for agricultural transformation through climate services. Again, here we are at data collection and monitoring stage, information products, institutional and policy support are the key components required. Many entrepreneurial efforts, startups, etc. are beginning to serve under the name of smart agriculture as a broad umbrella. They're beginning to serve the agricultural industry and sector. That we have a long way to go. Weak technical capacity for data storage and analysis to translate the data collected from agriculture and meteorology sectors into climate services. So this is a bit of a technical detail on how the data and the forecasts and so on have to be translated into dashboard or a package that the farmers can actually use. So here we are at co-production and co-design of tailored product stage. Has some ways to go, but knowledge and capacity building and information products will be the key components to close those gaps. Lack of data sharing and standard operation procedures for coordination and co-production of climate services by multiple stakeholders. So typically you have the government trying to help the farmers trying to buy fertilizer from somewhere, they have to arrange waters from somewhere, water resource managers have to worry about releasing water for agriculture versus domestic and industrial use. So you have multiple users. Co-production and co-design of tailored products is where we are at, and again knowledge and capacity building and institutional and policy support are needed to close the gaps. Insufficient resources and budget for sustainable operation and upscaling of climate services. Funding, it depends. When we say lack of investment, it can be at the research and implementation stage. In the US, for example, getting interdisciplinary funding can be tricky, and there are directed funding calls even from NSF, like artificial intelligence and machine learning for smart agriculture, for example, which only one or two are given at the order of, let's say, 20 million over 5 years. And is that sufficient for such a big country, considering billions of dollars that are at stake from the agriculture and climate impacts on them and so on? It's the same in India as well. So it's generally true across the board for all countries. Insufficient resources and budget for the sustainable operation of and upscaling of climate services. So closing the gap, or if the university funded center develops a tool and hands it over to somebody who is going to make it sustainable in terms of operation and upscale it and transfer the solutions to other places. This again is at a co-production and co-design of tailored product stage. Hopefully this will continue to grow into scalable operations and funding for implementation. Again, here institutional and policy development are required. Weak coordination between the government, agriculture and meteorology entities and stakeholders across scales. This is a challenge because if you want to get the forecast from a center that's holding on to the forecast so that you can use them to apply downscale and apply it from scale, this transfer itself can be quite complicated. So the coordinations between various organizations becomes very critical, and small distrust from somebody in the middle can be debilitating in terms of just getting the work done to get to the farmers. Co-production and co-design of tailored products is where we are at. Again, knowledge and capacity building and institutional and policy support are needed for closing the gaps. Lack of impact data of weather and or climate risks on a cropping system and on various crops. So impact data is needed. For example, crop insurances are being issued or given now in India, and there are extreme events which come and hammer the crops. Right now in the pre-monsoon there have been unseasonal rains and hail that have damaged wheat crops, for example. How do we collect such systematic data to link the forecasts to potential impacts on agriculture, for example? Co-production and co-design of tailored products is where we're at, and again knowledge and capacity building are needed. Insufficient operational mechanisms, production and dissemination for localized and last mile climate services. So you have great product coming from, let's say, a research entity that's been translated, and then at the last mile, how is it going to be used by, let's say, an individual farmer who may be in subsistence farmer who doesn't have the wherewithal to handle the data, make decisions enough to understand the forecast to make decisions and add value to their own empirical decision process and so on. So here we are at communication of services to the last mile. Closing this gap will be tricky, and concerted efforts will be needed by all the stakeholders in this. Knowledge and capacity building and information and delivery use are required. So just to conclude this table, insufficient tailoring of the climate services to the needs and preferences of farmers resulting in reduced uptake and use. Climate-informed decisions are being made. Poor digital literacy among information users, making it slow for farmers to understand the potential application of advisory services in agriculture. So this understanding, awareness, capacity building is critical, but we are at the stage of climate-informed decisions. Lack of effective two-way communication between producers and users of information. So actual farmer on the ground to the place that is actually producing the information is not yet complete in terms of the feedback. So user feedback mechanisms to improve climate services are going on, but we need information delivery and use, and again institutional and policy support. This is kind of a general mantra that's going to work in every case. Unbalanced gender participation and knowledge gap with low finance to further engage farmers and improve the outreach of advisories. So female farmers are more and more in number in India, for example, because men leave the villages because the farming they consider is not as high income a profession as they would like, or sometimes they have to augment their income, so women will take up agriculture, men leave, so this gender imbalance can work in tricky ways. So here again we are at the stage of user feedback mechanisms to improve climate services, and of course we need information delivery and use and institutional and policy support. So in terms of the key components of climate services framework for agriculture, again these things sound fairly obvious and yet they are very critical. Knowledge and capacity building, information products, information delivery and use, and institutional policy and support. Okay, so reading a few headlines in each. Establish multidisciplinary technical working groups consisting of agricultural and meteorological stakeholders. Identify risks, needs and information networks at scales to understand the scale-dependent context of climate services. Capacity building of key stakeholders in the value chain for climate services. In the information products, we need tailored information with appropriate spatio-temporal resolution for informed decision making in different scales. This is really critical, the scales at which information has to be delivered for it to be actually used. Ministry of Agriculture, monitoring, predicting production of crop, livestock, pest, disease, etc. National Meteorological Service has to do its part, climate observations, forecasts and extreme warnings. Information delivery and use, we need climate service delivery channels, indigenous and state-of-the-art climate-smart agriculture practices, and integrated pest management practices as well. These are general and not obviously comprehensive, but as examples. Under institutional and policy support, for example, we need standard operating procedures with coordinated role and responsibility among government institutions, how the water information is managed, how agricultural information is managed at municipal level, state level, federal or central level, and so on, become handicaps if they are not coordinated and smooth. National climate risk adaptation plans, how will they affect agriculture? Will they be focused more at health and water, for example, and not care about agriculture, or will they be synergistic? Institutionalized information delivery and feedback and evaluation mechanism, national policy support for climate services. Okay, so finally coming towards what to do, the way forward, shared insights, learned experiences and recommendations from the agriculture climate services weeks and from the Agriculture Climate Services Weeks and the intensive review on climate services literature have highlighted the following areas for improvement, especially in developing countries. So this is critical for a country like India and the Global South. Sustainable operations and upscaling involve iterative loops along the key components which at the national level use the lessons learned from previous iterations of the framework. Priorities should be identified through the following questions. Who produces, translates, communicates, and uses climate services? What are the user's information needs? What specific information should be integrated and who can provide it? Which mechanisms and capacities should be developed or strengthened? How can these be implemented from institutional and policy perspectives? Regional collaborative efforts should be considered for sharing knowledge and increasing capacity through a peer-to-peer approach and or establishing regional training centers that are linked with projects and programs in regional agricultural universities and research institutes. This is very important, and making these links to regional and local research and agricultural universities and other engineering institutes, social scientists, etc., can really help close the last mile gap. A strategic collaboration between United Nations specialized agencies, the World Meteorological Organization, and the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations would enable such regional learning initiatives and could develop a regional standardized framework to guide and document data collection, sharing, analysis, climate services creation, and the last mile communication. A national roadmap to strengthen and operationalize climate services for the agriculture sector, which considers the 4 key components described above, could be incorporated into the operational budgets, resourcing, and standard operating procedures. Early buy-in from policymakers is important through a proactive program to raise awareness during the developmental stage of the climate services. Finally, to strengthen climate services at the local scale, local authorities should be recognized, establishing a mandatory communication system between the national and subnational authorities prior to releasing climate services. So the information flow is defined and clear from the beginning with no gaps. Participatory approaches such as the farmer field schools could facilitate information uptake and subsequent action by updating products with local technical resources, which would help sustain climate services and crowdsource key data for improving advisories. As localized climate services require high-resolution climate and agricultural data, significant funding, either internal or external, should be invested in rehabilitating existing weather stations and improving the technical capacity of government organizations for data collection and management, forecasting and crop monitoring, including the use of remote sensing technologies. Ensure meaningful feedback mechanisms among actors and users to systematically integrate user needs and preferences along the climate service value chain. What this report doesn't get into in terms of details is that the forecasts from models are typically issued at order, let's say 10 kilometers or sometimes even tens of kilometers. To reduce that information to local scales, farm scales literally, you need lots of data. You need to use AI ML techniques to combine the data and forecasts, or past forecasts, what are called hindcasts, to produce ways to quickly and routinely translate forecasts into local information. So you need hindcasts which have to come from operational agencies. You need a lot of data which has to be funded and maintained by somebody. It cannot be done as a project mode. It has to be a sustained mission mode. And then you have to have a way of routinely issuing downscaled farm scale information on the user needs, to meet the user needs. Okay, this is very critical. Okay, so I will leave this here, but you get the main points, and hopefully that you can follow up with other literature. This paper from BAMS has lots of very good references that you can look up for further details. Okay.